Ukraine has scrambled Azov troops to prevent a Russian breakthrough near its fortress belt defensive lines in the fiercely contested Eastern Donbas, as Russia and America traded veiled nuclear threats ahead of the highest stake peace talks of the war. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're starting today with the battle for Dooria in Ukraine's Eastern Donetsk province. Over the course of the last few days, Russian forces have made a surprise and fast advance across 10 to 12 kilometres of land. We're going to look at what's happened, how it's happened, and why it matters. Russian troops from the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade appear to have advanced north from around a place called Novotoretsk to an area around the village of Rubizhne, and they appear to advance in a sort of two-pronged assault. Now, this was first reported on Ukraine's deep state map, which tracks all sorts of open source information to keep track of where the front lines are. And when it was reported, it's fair to say it caused much panic, partly because of the speed of the advance and also because of where it was. Now, exactly what has happened and crucially exactly how many Russian soldiers are involved is disputed, but it appears that small numbers of dismounted Russian infantry, some of them using motorbikes, or I suppose mounted on motorbikes, but not using heavy armoured cars, and crucially in small groups, have managed to advance relatively quickly after spotting weak points in Ukraine's defence. Now, this also appears to have coincided with a rotation of the soldiers on the front line. Ukraine's Azov brigade has taken over responsibility, Ukraine's Azov Corps, newly formed Azov Corps, has taken responsibility for that area of the front line, and it may have been during a time of transition, a time of handover, which is typically vulnerable, especially as new soldiers are getting familiar with the terrain, that this attack took place. Ukraine has described it as an infiltration rather than an assault, and they've described the soldiers involved as sabotage and reconnaissance soldiers, claiming that this is not a fully fledged breakthrough. Indeed, Russian military bloggers have also expressed some caution to their own audiences not to celebrate this too early, not to make more of it than it actually is. Nonetheless, certainly cause for concern that Russia is using these small unit tactics effectively. Now, whether or not this is a successful operation remains to be seen, but these are tactics which we've seen evolving over many, many months, if not years. Instead of massing large numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles to try and punch through lines, actually dispersing soldiers in small groups, sometimes twos, sometimes fours, using a combination of stealth and speed and manoeuvrability to bypass or to get past prepared defensive positions. They've picked a weak point in the lines as well. Of course, that's important to Russia's success. What will depend, whether this is really successful, depends on whether or not Russia can hold this ground, and early indications are, in fact, that those soldiers who've advanced have become isolated. Different analysts claiming different things. Michael Kaufman, a respected analyst, suggesting that the reality may well be worse than we're hearing on the ground at the moment. We're going to talk about why it's important. There are three reasons why this advance is potentially significant. The first is that the Russian forces will threaten the Dobropilya-Konstantinivka road. That is a highway which Ukraine has used to keep Konstantinivka, and before that Bakhmut, and before that and Chasiv Yar and Kramatorsk supplied with forces. It's a key supply route through Eastern Donetsk province. It's a road I've driven many, many times. I've driven it many times when it was considered very, very safe. The front lines have now moved to such an extent that if Russian forces can cut that, it won't leave Konstantinivka totally cut off. There are other ways of reaching it, but of course it makes it harder. If Russia continues to chip away at the front lines and continues to threaten more supply routes, then those soldiers, those forces in Konstantinivka and indeed further north in Kramatorsk will become increasingly vulnerable. It also threatens the town of Dobropilya itself. Again, Dobropilya, for many, many years, a sort of relatively safe transit point, really, for Ukraine's forces, but it's become an increasingly important logistics hub as the front lines have moved closer to it. With that advance, Russian forces are now within 15 kilometres to the east of that town. And finally, of course, the timing is really important because this comes in the build-up to the most important, the highest stake peace talks of the war so far, the first face-to-face meeting between Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Anchorage in Alaska. And by advancing, and indeed by the panic that advance created, it risks cementing the myth, and it is a myth, but it risks cementing the myth of the inevitability of Russian victory in this war. That is a myth that Putin is trying to sell to the Ukrainians, that he's trying to sell to the West, and without doubt he will try and sell to Donald Trump, that Russia is bound to win, so there is no point resisting. Ukraine has proven that to be categorically untrue over the last 3.5 years. But nonetheless, were Ukraine's allies to swallow that lie, to believe that Russia's victory is inevitable, then that might discourage them from continuing to support Ukraine, and that may make the myth come true if Ukraine were thrown to the wolves, God forbid. Now, before we come to those peace talks, we're just going to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the close battle. President Zelensky has talked this week about Russia moving about 30,000 troops to different parts of the front line. The second in command of Ukraine's GUR, military intelligence, has listed 4 towns as the priority for Russia's advances. Those are Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, we've known about, we've talked about a lot, Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is the high ground just west of Bakhmut. If you've been following this show for long enough to remember the battle for Bakhmut, the very fact that Ukrainian forces are still defending Chasiv Yar, which was just to the west of it, shows how slow Russia's advances have been. What's happened east of Dobropilya is the exception. It was speedy, although that has, I should say, been compared to sort of reconnaissance forays that Russian troops made into Pokrovsk town, again, which has been at the centre of huge Russian effort, and they were subsequently beaten out because small numbers can get in, but if they can't be resupplied, then they can't sustain, and indeed those soldiers are incredibly vulnerable. We've seen some accounts coming out on Twitter, video interviews that appear to be with soldiers captured in Dobropilya, as we did in previous skirmishes where small Russian groups have been overrun and defeated. We've also seen, it's worth noting, increased shelling of Kherson city. Some analysts suggesting that this fits a pattern of a new Russian tactic of trying to destroy all defensive positions ahead of an advance before sending in small teams to infiltrate. And there's some speculation that we might be about to see something like that in Kherson city. Remember, Kherson, the only provincial capital, regional capital that Russia captured during this conflict in the early stages of the war. They were beaten back in the 1st November 2022. However, they have been kept to the left bank of the Dnipro River. It would be a significant logistical effort for Russian forces to come across again, but both sides fighting furiously to try and gain every strength and possible advantage they can as these crunch talks between Donald Trump and President Putin loom. On to the talks. Both sides, Russia and America, traded veiled nuclear threats this week as part of the sort of manoeuvring ahead of the summit between Trump and Putin, which is due to take place on a military base in Anchorage, the capital of Alaska. We saw Vice President J.D. Vance, who's been here in the United Kingdom on holiday, addressing US airmen at RAF Fairford. Now, RAF Fairford is actually an American airbase in Gloucestershire in the southwest of England, which is used by American nuclear bombers, almost exclusively by long-range American nuclear bombers, B-2 Spirits, B-52 Stratofortresses. They fly over the Atlantic, they land there, they use it as a staging post. So for him to stand there is significant, to address airmen there is significant, and so was his message. His message was that peace in Europe is only possible if, and his words, the bad guys are afraid of American military might. Interestingly, as he was speaking in this hangar at RAF Fairford, he was standing in front of an American U-2 spy plane. Now that is a a high-altitude spy plane which has been in service, I think, since the late 1950s. And indeed, in 1960, it was one of these aircraft known as the Dragon Lady that was shot down over Russia, over the Soviet Union, by a surface-to-air missile as it tried to spy on Russian military installations. So a brief speech, but nonetheless rich with symbolism. On the other hand, we've seen in Belarus, the Belarusian defense minister announcing joint military drills with Russia, exercise Zapad 2025, which he said would include training for the deployment of nuclear weapons, including Russia's new a nuclear-capable Oreshnik missile. He said that this was strategic deterrence and Belarus had to be ready for anything. You'll remember the Oreshnik, an intermediate-range ballistic missile, first fired in anger against Ukraine in a conventional strike, no nuclear warheads, against the city of Dnipro last year. So both of them building up that rhetoric, a reminder to us and indeed to all involved in those talks, reminded to Ukraine and Ukraine's allies of exactly what is at stake. And we talk about it a lot, but fundamentally we cannot escape that the undercurrent swirling behind this conflict is the threat of nuclear Armageddon, is the risk that this spirals into an Article 5 conflict, into nuclear war between NATO and Russia. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. In our next episode, I'm sure we'll be looking at the outcome of those talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. For the moment, though, we've got 3 questions for this week. The first is about Australia buying Russian oil. Is Australia buying Russian oil? Why is it buying Russian oil? It's extraordinary, and it's true. Research and reports by Sky News Australia said that Australia was the largest purchaser of Russian oil products, buying about 5.5 billion Australian dollars worth in the last 12 months. Now, this is based on research by the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air. That's a Finnish non-profit think tank which tracked exports and trades around the world. That was in March this year. Interestingly, in June this year, so a few months after that, the Australian government published updated guidance on its sanctions. Now, Australia is party to its imposed sanctions against the purchase of Russian oil, but it does not cover, and it explicitly states this, it does not apply to products transformed, is the word they use, in third countries. So what that means is that Russia can export crude oil to countries, which it does, which are not party to sanctions: India, China and Turkey, all significant markets. That crude oil can be refined there and then sold on, and Australia can buy those refined products, can and does buy. We've also seen, while we're on this, that India has emerged as the largest buyer of Russian oil and gas products since the start of the war. And that's extraordinary because at the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022, India accounted for almost nothing of Russia's oil and gas sales, and it has now emerged as the largest single purchaser, accounting for about a third of Russia's sales. India, according to figures published in the Financial Times, buys about £100 million worth of Russian oil a day. Question number 2 is about the US Abrams tanks. What's happened to them? I'm really glad you asked this, actually, because I'd slightly lost track of this, but there's an account in the Kyiv Post, a fairly reliable Ukrainian newspaper, saying that only 4 out of the 31 US tanks that were gifted to Ukraine are still in service. The rest have been destroyed. So that's the reason we're not seeing very much of those US Abrams tanks, and that's likely a reflection of 2 things. The evolution of this war, that armour is always at risk because of the advancements in long-range precision strike drones, the ability to find and then destroy high-value targets. It's also worth remembering that this is slightly speculative, but those Abrams tanks that were gifted to Ukraine came on a very long lead time. So they were promised, but it took about a year for them to arrive. And analysts at the time were suggesting that was because they were being stripped of or manufactured for Ukraine without a lot of the best technology that goes into the American variants of the tanks because of the risk that they would be captured. Indeed, some have been captured. America didn't want that technology falling into Russian hands. And finally, why can't Ukraine make good defensive positions in the rear? Well, the short answer is Ukraine can, and it does. And as I drive around Ukraine on those reporting trips, we see those defences, and they have got more and more and more as this war has gone on. You can be hundreds of miles sometimes from the front lines, and you will see huge trench lines carving up Ukraine's vast agricultural landscape. And indeed, in the Eastern Donbas, as I've mentioned in this episode, there is the fortress belt. And indeed, I drove through that fortress belt on my last trip as we were going towards artillery positions. So it was behind artillery positions. Not speak too specifically about what we saw or where it was, but nonetheless, it was similar to the accounts we've seen of the Russian defensive lines, the so-called Surovikin line, built ahead of Ukraine's, and indeed which slowed Ukraine's 2023 counter-offensive. Things like dragon's teeth and large concrete triangular blocks that will stop armoured vehicles, rolls and rolls of razor wire that will slow down an infantry assault, and trenches and tank traps. Those lines do exist, but no line is impermeable if it faces the right kind of attack that can be sustained for long enough. Thank you very much for watching. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you next time. We're in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle, and we're heading towards the Russian border.